双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Bentham, by John Stuart Mill, London and Westminster Review, August 1838, revised in 1859 in Dissertations and Discussion.
Vol. I.
There are two men, recently deceased, to whom their country is indebted not only for the greater part of the important ideas which have been thrown into circulation among its thinking men in their time, but for a revolution in its general modes of thought and investigation. These men, dissimilar in almost all else, agreed in being closet students, secluded in a peculiar degree, by circumstances and character, from the business and intercourse of the world, and both were, through a large portion of their lives, regarded by those who took the lead in opinion when they happened to hear of them, with feelings akin to contempt. But they were destined to renew a lesson given to mankind by every age, and always disregarded, to show that speculative philosophy, which to the superficial appears a thing so remote from the business of life and the outward interests of men, is in reality the thing on earth which most influences them, and in the long run overbears every other influence save those which it must itself obey. The writers of whom we speak have never been read by the multitude, except for the more slight of their works. Their readers have been few, but they have been the teachers of the teachers. There is hardly to be found in England an individual of any importance in the world of mind, who, whatever opinions he may have afterwards adopted, did not first learn to think from one of these two. And though their influences have but begun to diffuse themselves through these intermediate channels over society at large, there is already scarcely a publication of any consequence addressed to the educated classes, which, if these persons had not existed, would not have been different from what it is. These men are Jeremy Bentham and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the two great seminal minds of England in their age. No comparison is intended here between the minds or influences of these remarkable men. This was impossible unless there were first formed a complete judgment of each. Considered apart, it is our intention to attempt, on the present occasion, an estimate of one of them, the only one, a complete edition of whose works is yet in progress, and who, in the classification which may be made of all writers into progressive and conservative, belongs to the same division with ourselves. For although they were far too great men to be correctly designated by either appellation exclusively, yet in the main, Bentham was a progressive philosopher, Coleridge a conservative one. The influence of the former has made itself felt chiefly on minds of the progressive class, of the latter, on those of the conservative, and the two systems of concentric circles, which the shock given by them is spreading over the ocean of mind, have only just begun to meet and intersect. The writings of both contain severe lessons to their own side, on many of the errors and faults they are addicted to, but to Bentham it was given to discern more particularly those truths with which existing doctrines and institutions were at variance. To Coleridge, the neglected truths which lay in them. A man of great knowledge of the world, and of the highest reputation for practical talent and sagacity among the official men of his time, himself no follower of Bentham, nor of any partial or exclusive school whatever, once said to us, as the result of his observation, that to Bentham more than to any other source might be traced the questioning spirit, the disposition to demand the why of everything, which had gained so much ground and was producing such important consequences in these times. The more this assertion is examined, the more true it will be found. Bentham has been in this age and country the great questioner of things established. It is by the influence of the modes of thought with which his writings inoculated a considerable number of thinking men that the yoke of authority has been broken, and innumerable opinions, formerly received on tradition as incontestable, are put upon their defense, and required to give an account of themselves, who, before Bentham, whatever controversies might exist on points of detail, dared to speak disrespectfully, in express terms, of the British Constitution, or the English law. He did so, and his arguments and his example together encouraged others. We do not mean that his writings caused the Reform Bill, or that the appropriation clause owns him as its parent. The changes which have been made, and the greater changes which will be made, in our institutions, are not the work of philosophers, but of the interests and instincts of large portions of society recently grown into strength. But Bentham gave voice to those interests and instincts. Until he spoke out, those who found our institutions unsuited to them did not dare to say so, did not dare consciously to think so. They had never heard the excellence of those institutions questioned by cultivated men, by men of acknowledged intellect, and it is not in the nature of uninstructed minds to resist the united authority of the instructed. Bentham broke the spell. It was not Bentham by his own writings. It was Bentham through the minds and pens which those writings fed, through the men in more direct contact with the world, into whom his spirit passed. If the superstition about ancestorial wisdom has fallen into decay, if the public are grown familiar with the idea that their laws and institutions are in great part not the product of intellect and virtue, but of modern corruption grafted upon ancient barbarism, if the hardiest innovation is no longer scouted because it is an innovation, establishments no longer considered sacred because they are establishments, it will be found that those who have accustomed the public mind to these ideas have learnt them in Bentham's school, and that the assault on ancient institutions has been, and is, carried on for the most part with his weapons. It matters not although these thinkers, or indeed thinkers of any description, have been but scantily found among the persons prominently and ostensibly at the head of the reform movement. All movements, except directly revolutionary ones, are headed, not by those who originate them, but by those who know best how to compromise between the old opinions and the new. The father of English innovation both in doctrines and in institutions is Bentham. He is the great subversive,
or,
in the language of continental philosophers, the great critical thinker of his age and country. We consider this, however, to be not his highest title to fame. Were this all, he were only to be ranked among the lowest order of the potentates of mind, the negative, or destructive philosophers, those who can perceive what is false, but not what is true, who awaken the human mind to the inconsistencies and absurdities of time-sanctioned opinions and institutions, but substitute nothing in the place of what they take away. We have no desire to undervalue the services of such persons. Mankind have been deeply indebted to them, nor will there ever be a lack of work for them. In a world in which so many false things are believed, in which so many which have been true are believed long after they have ceased to be true, the qualities, however, which fit men for perceiving anomalies, without perceiving the truths which would rectify them, are not among the rarest of endowments. Courage, verbal acuteness, command over the forms of argumentation, and a popular style, will make, out of the shallowest man, with a sufficient lack of reverence, a considerable negative philosopher. Such men have never been wanting in periods of culture, and the period in which Bentham formed his early impressions was emphatically their reign, in proportion to its barrenness in the more noble products of the human mind. An age of formalism in the church and corruption in the state, when the most valuable part of the meaning of traditional doctrines had faded from the minds even of those who retained from habit a mechanical belief in them, was the time to raise up all kinds of skeptical philosophy. Accordingly, France had Voltaire and his school of negative thinkers, and England, or rather Scotland, had the profoundest negative thinker on record, David Hume, a man, the peculiarities of whose mind qualified him to detect failure of proof, and one of logical consistency, at a depth which French skeptics, with their comparatively feeble powers of analysis and abstraction, stop far short of, and which German subtlety alone could thoroughly appreciate, or hope to rival. If Bentham had merely continued the work of Hume, he would scarcely have been heard of in philosophy, for he was far inferior to Hume in Hume's qualities, and was in no respect fitted to excel as a metaphysician. We must not look for subtlety, or the power of recondite analysis, among his intellectual characteristics. In the former quality, Few great thinkers have ever been so deficient, and to find the latter, in any considerable measure, in a mind acknowledging any kindred with his, we must have recourse to the late Mr. Mill, a man who united the great qualities of the metaphysicians of the 18th century, with others of a different complexion, admirably qualifying him to complete and correct their work. Bentham had not these peculiar gifts, but he possessed others, not inferior, which were not possessed by any of his precursors, which have made him a source of light to a generation which has far outgrown their influence, and, as we called him, the chief subversive thinker of an age which has long lost all that they could subvert. To speak of him first as a merely negative philosopher, as one who refutes illogical arguments, exposes sophistry, detects contradiction and absurdity. Even in that capacity, there was a wide field left vacant for him by Hume, and which he has occupied to an unprecedented extent, the field of practical abuses. This was Bentham's peculiar province. To this he was called by the whole bent of his disposition, to carry the warfare against absurdity into things practical. His was an essentially practical mind. It was by practical abuses that his mind was first turned to speculation, by the abuses of the profession which was chosen for him, that of the law. He has himself stated what particular abuse first gave that shock to his mind, the recoil of which has made the whole mountain of abuse totter. It was the custom of making the client pay for 3 attendances in the office of a master in chancery, when only one was given. The law, he found, on examination, was full of such things. But were these discoveries of his? No. They were known to every lawyer who practiced, to every judge who sat on the bench, and neither before nor for long after did they cause any apparent uneasiness to the consciences of these learned persons, nor hinder them from asserting, whenever occasion offered, in books, in Parliament, or on the bench, that the law was the perfection of reason, during so many generations, in each of which thousands of educated young men were successively placed in Bentham's position and with Bentham's opportunities. He alone was found with sufficient moral sensibility and self-reliance to say to himself that these things, however profitable they might be, were frauds, and that between them and himself there should be a gulf fixed. To this rare union of self-reliance and moral sensibility we are indebted for all that Bentham has done. Sent to Oxford by his father at the unusually early age of 15, required, on admission, to declare his belief in the 39 Articles, he felt it necessary to examine them, and the examination suggested scruples, which he sought to get removed. But instead of the satisfaction he expected was told that it was not for boys like him to set up their judgment against the great men of the Church. After a struggle, he signed, but the impression that he had done an immoral act never left him. He considered himself to have committed a falsehood, and throughout life he never relaxed in his indignant denunciations of all laws which command such falsehoods, all institutions which attach rewards to them. By thus carrying the war of criticism and refutation, the conflict with falsehood and absurdity, into the field of practical evils, Bentham, even if he had done nothing else, would have earned an important place in the history of intellect. He carried on the warfare without intermission. To this, not only many of his most piquant chapters, but some of the most finished of his entire works, are entirely devoted. The Defense of Usury, the Book of Fallacies, and the Onslaught upon Blackstone, published anonymously under the title of A Fragment on Government, which, though a first production, and of a writer afterwards so much ridiculed for his style, excited the highest admiration no less for its composition than for its thoughts, and was attributed by turns to Lord Mansfield, to Lord Camden, and by Dr. Johnson, to Dunning, one of the greatest masters of style among the lawyers of his day. These writings are altogether original. Though of the negative school, they resemble nothing previously produced by negative philosophers, and would have sufficed to create for Bentham, among the subversive thinkers of modern Europe, a place peculiarly his own. But it is not these writings that constitute the real distinction between him and them. There was a deeper difference. It was that they were purely negative thinkers. He was positive. They only assailed error. He made it a point of conscience not to do so until he thought he could plant instead the corresponding truth. Their character was exclusively analytic. His was synthetic. They took for their starting point the received opinion on any subject, dug round it with their logical implements, pronounced its foundations defective, and condemned it. He began de novo, laid his own foundations deeply and firmly, built up his own structure, and bade mankind compare the two. It was when he had solved the problem himself, or thought he had done so, that he declared all other solutions to be erroneous. Hence, what they produced will not last. It must perish. Much of it has already perished. With the errors which it exploded, what he did has its own value, by which it must outlast all errors to which it is opposed. Though we may reject, as we often must, his practical conclusions, yet his premises, the collections of facts and observations from which his conclusions were drawn, remain forever a part of the materials of philosophy. A place, therefore, must be assigned to Bentham among the masters of wisdom, the great teachers and permanent intellectual ornaments of the human race. He is among those who have enriched mankind with imperishable gifts, and although these do not transcend all other gifts, nor entitle him to those honors above all Greek, above all Roman fame, which, by a natural reaction against the neglect and contempt of the ignorant, many of his admirers were once disposed to accumulate upon him, yet to refuse an admiring recognition of what he was, on account of what he was not, is a much worse error, and one which, pardonable in the vulgar, is no longer permitted to any cultivated and instructed mind. If we were asked to say, in the fewest possible words, what we conceive to be Bentham's place among these great intellectual benefactors of humanity, what he was and what he was not, what kind of service he did and did not render to truth, we should say he was not a great philosopher, but he was a great reformer in philosophy. He brought into philosophy something which it greatly needed, and for want of which it was at a stand. It was not his doctrines which did this. It was his mode of arriving at them. He introduced into morals and politics those habits of thought and modes of investigation which are essential to the idea of science, and the absence of which made those departments of inquiry, as physics had been before Bacon, a field of interminable discussion, leading to no result. It was not his opinions, in short, but his method, that constituted the novelty and the value of what he did, a value beyond all price, even though we should reject the whole, as we unquestionably must a large part, of the opinions themselves. Bentham's method may be shortly described as the method of detail, of treating wholes by separating them into their parts, abstractions by resolving them into things, classes and generalities by distinguishing them into the individuals of which they are made up, and breaking every question into pieces before attempting to solve it. The precise amount of originality of this process, considered as a logical conception, its degree of connection with the methods of physical science, or with the previous labors of Bacon, Hobbes, or Locke, is not an essential consideration in this case. Whatever originality there was in the method, in the subjects he applied it to, and in the rigidity with which he adhered to it, there was the greatest. Hence his interminable classifications. Hence his elaborate demonstrations of the most acknowledged truths, that murder, incendiarism, robbery, are mischievous actions. He will not take for granted without proof. Let the thing appear ever so self-evident. He will know the why and the how of it with the last degree of precision. He will distinguish all the different mischiefs of a crime, whether of the first, the second, or the third order, namely 1. The evil to the sufferer, and to his personal connections. 2. The danger from example, and the alarm or painful feeling of insecurity. And 3. The discouragement to industry and useful pursuits arising from the alarm, and the trouble and resources which must be expended in warding off the danger. After this enumeration, he will prove from the laws of human feeling that even the first of these evils, the sufferings of the immediate victim, will on the average greatly outweigh the pleasure reaped by the offender. Much more when all the other evils are taken into account. Unless this could be proved, he would account the infliction of punishment unwarrantable. And for taking the trouble to prove it formally, his defense is, there are truths which it is necessary to prove, not for their own sakes, because they are acknowledged, but that an opening may be made for the reception of other truths which depend upon them. It is in this manner we provide for the reception of first principles, which, once received, prepare the way for admission of all other truths, to which may be added, that in this manner also we discipline the mind for practicing the same sort of dissection upon questions more complicated and of more doubtful issue. It is a sound maxim, and one which all close thinkers have felt, but which no one before Bentham ever so consistently applied, that error lurks in generalities, that the human mind is not capable of embracing a complex whole until it has surveyed and catalogued the parts of which that whole is made up, that abstractions are not realities per se, but an abridged mode of expressing facts, and that the only practical mode of dealing with them is to trace them back to the facts, whether of experience or of consciousness, of which they are the expression. Proceeding on this principle, Bentham makes short work with the ordinary modes of moral and political reasoning. These, it appeared to him, when hunted to their source, for the most part terminated in phrases. In politics, liberty, social order, constitution, law of nature, social compact, etc., were the catchwords. Ethics had its analogous ones. Such were the arguments on which the gravest questions of morality and policy were made to turn, not reasons, but allusions to reasons, sacramental expressions, by which a summary appeal was made to some general sentiment of mankind, or to some maxim in familiar use, which might be true or not, but the limitations of which no one had ever critically examined. And this satisfied other people, but not Bentham. He required something more than opinion as a reason for opinion. Whenever he found a phrase used as an argument for or against anything, he insisted upon knowing what it meant, whether it appealed to any standard, or gave intimation of any matter of fact relevant to the question. And if he could not find that it did either, he treated it as an attempt on the part of the disputant to impose his own individual sentiment on other people, without giving them a reason for it, a contrivance for avoiding the obligation of appealing to any external standard, and for prevailing upon the reader to accept of the author's sentiment and opinion as a reason, and that a sufficient one, for itself. Bentham shall speak for himself on this subject. The passage is from his first systematic work, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, and we could scarcely quote anything more strongly exemplifying both the strength and weakness of his mode of philosophizing. It is curious enough to observe the variety of inventions men have hit upon, and the variety of phrases they have brought forward, in order to conceal from the world, and, if possible, from themselves, this very general and therefore very pardonable self-sufficiency. Point 1. One man says, he has a thing made on purpose to tell him what is right and what is wrong, and that is called a moral sense. And then he goes to work at his ease, and says, such a thing is right, and such a thing is wrong. Why? Because my moral sense tells me it is.
2.
Another man comes and alters the phrase, leaving out moral, and putting in common in the room of it. He then tells you that his common sense tells him what is right and wrong, as surely as the other's moral sense did, meaning by common sense a sense of some kind or other, which, he says, is possessed by all mankind. The sense of those whose sense is not the same as the author's being struck out as not worth taking. This contrivance does better than the other. For a moral sense being a new thing, a man may feel about him a good while without being able to find it out. But common sense is as old as the creation, and there is no man but would be ashamed to be thought not to have as much of it as his neighbors. It has another great advantage. By appearing to share power, it lessens envy. For when a man gets up upon this ground, in order to anathematize those who differ from him, it is not by a sic volo sic jubeo, but by a volitus jubiatus. 3. Another man comes and says that as to a moral sense indeed, he cannot find that he is any such thing.
That,
However, he has an understanding which will do quite as well. This understanding, he says, is the standard of right and wrong. It tells him so and so.